Hey, well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be speaking with you today. As Andrew mentioned, I was the Director of Mental Health, Crisis Intervention, and Suicide Prevention for the LA Unified School District, and have been a member of the Teachers Union for over 20 years and a member of the Administrators Union for over 10 years. So the information that I'm bringing you today is really my perception. It isn't meant to represent all schools, as there are over 100,000 schools in the United States and over 15,000 school districts. And also some of the things that I will be sharing with you are really lessons learned from the people who have attempted to institute mental health programs, crisis intervention, and who themselves may have been victims and survivors of many of the recent events that have plagued schools in terms of exposure to life-threatening violence. I'm so happy to hear that there will be a separate webinar that will address the issue of No Child Left Behind, because it probably is the most prevailing educational policy that captures the hearts and minds of educators and administrators in a way that to some extent excludes the concerns that we are talking about today. But its primary focus is to close the achievement gap so that no child is left behind. The achievement gap has really been written about a great deal, but Shin is one of the authors in 2005 who really began to talk about the achievement gap in terms of racial and cultural issues. And it was how to explain the bleak reality that African Americans, Latino students, Native Americans, and other ethnic and racial minorities continued to trail behind Caucasian peers in their schools, no matter where they were in the country. And one of the things that's always been an interest to me is that we never looked at the negative effects of trauma or violence exposure. And I think that that's something probably all of us on this phone call have in common, is that we wonder to what extent does it affect children's academic performance in schools, the climate in schools, and also the emotional well-being of our students. There are many obstacles to school-based programs, and schools, I think, just in terms of the way that they're structured, make it difficult to enter. That is not just something that we perceive, but it really is a reality, and it has something to do with what educators call mission creep, and that is, for some educators and administrators, it's all about learning. It's about math, English, reading, and that mental health and other kinds of services, however helpful they may be to students, are things that educators believe they're not trained to do, and that should not be part of what goes on in a classroom or on the school grounds every day. Also, there are less than ideal clinical conditions. Most schools have to deal with shortages of classroom space. And so myself, as a social worker, when I was in schools, had to sit outside in a bench. I know some of you have had to do that. And what I call Flushing Meadows, which is a corner of the girls' bathroom, where I met with some of the girls because there was absolutely no other place for us to meet. I've met children in electrical closets, really in some pretty appalling places when you start to say out loud where it is that you did have provided some intervention to students. Also, educators have really no training. If we look at the preparation programs for teachers, there is no training in mental health issues of children. They touch upon some developmental issues, but really they haven't brought in the most recent science of brain research and child development. So they go in as subject experts in math or in English, but they really have not much experience in terms of a formal class in child development. So unless their parents or themselves have taken it upon themselves to study this area, don't have much experience in understanding children's behavior, separate and apart from learning. Also, tailoring the program for schools can be quite a challenge, as the daily bell schedule can change depending upon whether it's a full day or a partial day or a teacher's, education day. For schools that are overcrowded, there may be up to 6 different tracks over sort of starting and beginning at different times of the year to accommodate large numbers of children. And also, it also adds to the whole idea of less than ideal about the 50-minute hour or an hour and a half for groups, when classes only go perhaps for 45 to 50 minutes every day, and then there's a very brief passing period. I wanted to talk a little about the events of the last 20 years that's really changed the culture of education. And, education is one of the most enduring and stable institutions of our country. And up to about 1990, I think for the most part, students who went to school probably followed a similar schedule that many of us on this call followed, and that is that you had to be an early person in education to get up early, to arrive early. You had your academic subjects in the morning. You always had a recess or a nutritional break. In the afternoon, there was the less academic subjects, maybe art or, other subjects. But around 1990, that really began in earnest what we know now as the school shootings. And there have been well over probably 700 completed school shootings, not just attempts. I don't think anyone's ever tried to identify the number of attempts. But it really did change, because up until that time, nobody really imagined that students could be targets of violence within a classroom or within a school. And in 1995, the situation in Oklahoma City underscored that fact, that children could be targeted victims of terrorism, because Timothy McVeigh and his co-conspirators specifically chose the Murrah building to bomb, in that they knew that there was a child care and day school in the basement, and they wanted to create as much pain and harm to children and to adults, so that those children who died were killed as targeted victims. This extended in 2001 in the terrorist attacks in New York City, where 9 schools were in very close proximity to the Twin Towers, and thousands of children, over 9,000 of them, had to evacuate in a moment's notice. And many of the schools to which they would have evacuated in their safe school plan were themselves at risk for the explosion that occurred after the planes crashed into the Twin Towers and then they collapsed. Now we are dealing with the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Middle East, as we have young families in many schools where there are high rates of children whose one or more parents who have been deployed to the Middle East, and we are beginning to see the impact of that upon their daily school attendance, upon rates of troubled, distressing behavior, and also some suicide attempts among younger children who are experiencing the loss of a parent in some very serious ways. As we look at what's happened in Japan, and of course what happened in Katrina and in earthquakes around the world, thousands and thousands of children are being displaced from their schools and are not attending schools. And the whole idea of how we return them and identify children who are experiencing PTSD or even traumatic stress, and how we provide them services, are going to be a greater challenge. I have the next 2 slides here. As you can see, that the first school shooting began in 1979 in San Diego, and for several years it did not, there were no others. But in 1984 in Los Angeles, we experienced one of the first school shootings, in which a mentally ill man who lived across the street from the 49th Street Elementary School simply began shooting onto the campus and held that school under sniper fire at 2:30 in the afternoon when children were coming out of class. And at the end of that hour and a half, 2 children were killed, and several other students and staff were shot and wounded. And it began our thinking about what we needed to do as we began to recognize that hundreds of children were traumatized, and we had no evidence-based practices to provide services to them. As you look at these dates, you can see that they become more and more frequent, and perhaps you can think back on the time when you began to read about this in the newspapers and began to wonder when this spate of shootings would stop. And as we realized, perhaps too late, that these were really incidents that had to be treated very much like suicides, that they were contagion events. And you can see now that there's less and less attention in the public media to these kinds of events. But what happened in schools is that children who were born after 1990, who were perhaps in, where maybe they were in kindergarten in 1990, and as they were going through their elementary, middle, and high school, they began to realize that a school shooting was entirely possible at their school, and that there was an intent to kill or maim by these shooters, the fellow students, that caused fear and panic, that there were both direct and indirect victims. And while the number of children might have been within 1 to 12 perhaps at a school, that the direct and indirect victims with respect to PTSD and the loss of children from the schools were thousands in number, and that it appeared that there was escalating violence that was occurring within schools across the country. The seminal event, of course, was Columbine, and it brought on the kind of community policing in which surveillance, they had to determine how to gain access to the schools so that SWAT teams could enter more quickly. The schools began to identify co-conspirators. They began to rethink the whole issues of discipline and planning. There were rehearsals of SWAT teams going onto schools, and there was whole idea of timing and how the school had to react to these kinds of events. And at the same time, it really did begin the rise of how we would deal with the mental health issues around these events. So in an instant, in a heartbeat, everything can change on the school, and this is really an entry point for many mental health providers in the community to help a school think through how they would respond in a crisis and how mental health professionals can play a role in K-12 programs across the country. An interdisciplinary crisis team began to be articulated, particularly after 1984 when we began our first crisis team. And you can see here that the people on the left, the first 4 sets of people representing disciplines in psychology, counseling, nursing, and social workers, were the core of an interdisciplinary team, and they were really the mental health professionals that led the team. But in addition to that, there was a realization that other individuals at the school had to play an important role, both for planning for future events, response, recovery, and also for prevention. In fact, there was Congress did fund REMS, which is Readiness and Emergency Management for Schools, in the amount of hundreds of millions of dollars. And over the past many years, school districts have been able to apply for up to $500,000 every year to plan for prevention activities, to prepare in every way, including for mental health services in the event of a crisis, to create response systems, and also to plan for recovery services. Knowing how to respond quickly and efficiently in a crisis is what schools are interested in, and so in a roundabout way, that's where mental health services become included. Almost every state now and almost every school district requires every school to have a safe school plan with an all hazards approach, and that drills are very much an essential part of each of the 4 phases. And here's where I'm wondering whether people in the community who are mental health professionals have joined these school-based teams. The whole idea also is, buzzword is safety. How do we provide a safe learning experience and prevent student and staff injury and death? Schools have also played an increasing role in being places where the community can go and after natural and man-made disasters.